Hi, everybody. I'm going to try something that I've never actually tried before, which is trying to do the picture in picture, and let's see if it messes up the readability of the slideshow. So we'll see how this goes. I'm also going to tell you that I'm messing. You might see me looking aside right now. I'm messing with the volume on the microphone, trying to figure out why it keeps redlining. It seems like my two choices are muffled or redline. So I'm trying to adjust it and make it sound decent. I apologize for any problems with these videos. I'm doing this by myself and I do not know how to do it. I'm a PhD in psychology, not a YouTuber, but here we go. All right, so this is my blanket apology for the whole quarter in case it's muffled or it's redlining. I'm doing the best I can. All right, now that I've gotten my apologies aside, let's go ahead and jump into theories of emotions. And so in this, I don't want to say chapter per se, but in this section, in this module, I'm going to try and bolster the content of the textbook that you're reading, Emotions Revealed, by giving you a little bit more concrete knowledge on some of the things that that book sort of is glossing over or sort of taking for granted. So that's the role that these lectures are going to play, is as sort of an ancillary to what is a very concrete and applied book. This will be a little bit more, theoretical side. All right, so let's get started. So first off, let's define emotion. All right, so in this picture, we can see an emotion being expressed by at least the three players that we can see on the field, right, or on the court. We can't necessarily, other people's faces look kind of neutral in the background. Maybe they're media personnel or something. So we don't know if this is an emotion that's being shared by everybody in the room, but we see an emotion being expressed. And it's really easy for us to see that emotion. What's harder is to define what an emotion is. What do we mean by the word emotion? So psychology has defined emotion as adaptive responses that support survival. Okay, so that kind of tells you why, not really what an emotion is, right? It tells you why it is. You probably have these emotions because somehow they help you to survive or have helped our ancestors to survive and become our ancestors. So that's probably not a very good definition of emotion. Yet, let's move on. So let's say that the emotion that we're experiencing is happy. I think we could probably agree that the people in the picture are experiencing at least happy. They might be experiencing something beyond happy, maybe more, and our textbook goes into some of these pleasant emotions, and the one that they're experiencing, our textbook might refer to as fiero. They're like all pumped up because they won, basically. Anyway, so I'm just going to call it happy for the purposes of this little smart art. All right. An emotion is made up in part by its physiological activation, right? Your heart rate elevates, your breathing rate might change, you might have sweaty palms or not, or flop sweat or not, your stomach might rumble or not, like these different kinds of things. Like with an emotion like happy, probably you're going to experience an elevated heart rate, probably faster breathing. You might even make noise when you breathe, something like a laugh or something that sounds kind of, gleeful. These would be evidence of physiological activation. And in research, of course, they actually measure that. So another component of an emotion would be the expressive behavior. In this case, we see smiling. Like that's kind of a universal sign that these people are probably happy, because they've got, I don't think you can get bigger smiles than what they're displaying in this picture, which is probably the first thing that led us to believe that they were probably happy, right? So there are these expressive behaviors. It could include things like smiling. It could include things like frowning, or your eyebrows might take a different position based on the emotion that you're experiencing. You may have different expressive behavior in your body, right? You may have shoulders back, or you might have shoulders slumped. You might have, sort of an elevation on your toes or not. Like, for example, you have one of the players is jumping in the air at the moment. People who are really happy, there's a phrase, I'm walking on air, right? this is part of that body language, that expression of the emotion that has nothing to do with the face necessarily, but may have to do with the body. And then there's the conscious experience, right? So you have this awareness that, like in the picture that we're seeing, I'm just going to I'm going to make a wild guess and say that these players just won a big important game. That's the limb I'm going to crawl out on this one, right? So this is their conscious experience, right? Like they just won the game. They're smiling. Their heart rates are up. They're going to label that experience as the emotion that we call happiness. All three of these things combine to make what we would call an emotion. There are no emotions that have been studied or labeled, at least for research purposes, that don't involve all three of these things. So it's really important to keep that in mind, that emotion is made up of physiological activation, expressive behavior, and conscious experience. All right. Now, in case you haven't studied the autonomic nervous system, a prerequisite for this class is Psych 100. So you probably did at least somewhat study the autonomic nervous system. But just in case you don't remember, I thought it would be important before we move on to kind of talk about the physiological arousal and where it comes from. So the autonomic nervous system is the part of your nervous system that really you don't have conscious control over. That's why it's called autonomic. It takes care of all these things by itself. The autonomic nervous system is divided into two parts. There's the sympathetic nervous system, which is known as the arousing system. And it's the part of the nervous system that gets you ready for fight or flight, right? So you've got your pupils dilating, your heart rate accelerates, your stomach stops processing the last meal that you ate, your pancreas doesn't secrete insulin, you aren't processing any food that had been in your stomach and ready to move on into the duodenum. It's not doing that, right? Like everything sort of stops at that moment because you're ready for fight or flight. You're not here to digest your food. You've got a bunch of glucose coming out of your liver so that you'll have plenty of nutrition for your muscles and things in case you have to fight or you have to flee. Your adrenal glands secrete a bunch of adrenaline so that you'll have the power and the endurance if you have to fight or flee. And always helpful whenever you're scared or angry is your bladder relaxes, right? Everybody enjoys that. You may have seen that in like a puppy that you've had where they get really super excited and then we always call it whittle for some reason. I'm not sure why we call it whittle when a puppy in excitement pees on the floor, but their bladder relaxes and it's a sign that their autonomic nervous system is activated, right? Their sympathetic nervous system is activated. So they're excited that you're petting them. They're excited that you're playing with them, and then they release their bladder. Now that last bit also we would expect not to happen in a fight or a flight. Your genitals. This is the part of the nervous system that allows for ejaculation in the male. It actually is probably very closely tied to orgasm, the triggering of orgasm. So hopefully this isn't during the fight or the flight that you're having orgasm in the middle of that, but it's the same part of the brain that controls that. So when you get really startled or you get really angry, which is an emotion, startled is an emotion, right? Like kind of it's a precursor to fear. You get really excitedly, like wound up, happy. Any of those things, that is going to activate the sympathetic nervous system. So that's what we mean by the physiological arousal. Like all these things are going to be impacted. As the emotion passes, then your parasympathetic nervous system can kick in and reverse all of the things that the sympathetic nervous system did. So your pupils will contract, your heart rate will slow back to normal, your stomach and digestive system will start to process food again, you'll release a bunch of bile out of the gallbladder, your bladder stops being relaxed, so you'll stop wetting yourself, and then this is also the part of the brain that allows for genital arousal, actually, for the blood to flow to the genitals to allow for erection of the clitoris or the penis. Sorry, this isn't human sexuality, so I won't go into too much detail. If you're intrigued, though, come take human sexuality. So the sympathetic nervous system gets aroused by the emotions, and then the parasympathetic nervous system repairs that or counterbalances that after the emotion has passed. So think about a time where you were maybe watching a comic or something, and it was sort of like funny joke, funny joke, funny joke, funny joke, and you're cracking up and stuff. And then there will be a little brief time where they're sort of telling you something that's not that funny, and it gives a moment for that parasympathetic nervous system to kick in and sort of bring everything back. Because if you sat in a comedy show and nonstop laughed for an hour and a half, you'd probably be exhausted. You might leave partway through because you couldn't take it. But comics know to allow a little bit of the parasympathetic moment to kind of return you back to normal before hitting you with some more jokes and making you laugh again. Because you can't take arousal for too long. Again, I don't want to go into too much detail on this because this is in stress and coping. But if you are facing something that needs to be dealt with in a fight or a flight, your body really has about 20 minutes to marshal its best arousal response and be able to cope with that threat or the thing that made you angry or whatever. And then you reach exhaustion. And so one of the things we're going to notice about emotions is that sincerely expressed emotions tend to be quite brief. Certainly less than 20 minutes. Honestly, real emotions might just flash across our faces or might cause us to laugh out loud and then we just go back to normal. There are social constraints that make us maybe keep a smile on our face after the laughter has passed, and we really don't feel like smiling, but it feels like a social convention that we need to. So there are some times that will drag out an expression of an emotion, but the true experience, the physiological arousal, that part of it is usually really brief. Seconds, maybe a minute or two, something like that. It's hard to maintain the level of physiological arousal required to actually experience that emotion in its entirety. So let's use an example of what we mean by how an emotion requires some degree of physiological arousal. So here are the parts of the body that are going to be affected by the sympathetic nervous system. So here we have a little boy who's about to fall off the dock, and here's his father rushing after him to try and make sure that that doesn't happen. So you can imagine that in this kind of situation where, his young child who maybe can't swim is at risk of falling into what looks like some pretty rough water next to the dock. So even if he fell in, he might hit his head on the dock or, some bad things could happen, right? So dad's scared. I think that's a pretty good characterization. They've drawn him pretty well, right? Dad's eyes are open, his eyebrows are up. That's really a good example of what the sympathetic nervous system does to the eyes. The pupils dilate and the eyebrows raise and the eyelids raise so that you can get more light in, so that you can actually see really well what you're doing. You can see that, let's see some other signs that he's experiencing fear. He's moving forward, he's got his arm extended, but he's not in a full run probably. He's trying really deliberately to make sure that his movements are deliberate. That's really common in fear, that you don't just lunge out and start doing something. A lot of times, in fact, people will freeze in fear. Some people call it the prey response, where in the context of something that's really frightening, you will actually freeze for a second and literally can't move. It's not that you need to just will yourself, literally you're frozen for a second. That's due to the sympathetic nervous system kind of getting you ready to be able to respond. We can imagine, we can't see this, but we can imagine that he's probably, his mouth has gone dry in fear that his son's going to fall into the water, right? He's maybe suddenly covered in flop sweat, or it might happen just as he gets to the sun, like maybe the body isn't ready to do it, but all of a sudden it all comes out once he actually reaches him. His respiration is he's probably panting rather than normal breathing. He's probably, his heart rate is probably up if we were to test it. His stomach is not concerned with digestion right now at all. He's probably getting a big dose of adrenaline so that he can move, quickly and with great strength. Right now, his immune system isn't functioning very well at all. It's not concerned about his long-term survival. It's concerned about his current situation. And so the immune system isn't working very well. Now, the good news is he got to his son, he was able to pull him back, everything's fine, and now this is where the parasympathetic nervous system does its job. It calms him down, returns now, look, his eyebrows are back down where they belong, he doesn't have his eyelids raised like they were, he's got a smile on his face in relief, right? He's like, thank goodness. Now, he might be currently still sweating, I have to say. He probably a lot of times in these kinds of circumstances, it's after the effect that you actually get that flop sweat, but it will quickly dry. It was just strictly because of the sympathetic nervous system arousal. He's probably going to, be able to take some deep breaths and get back to normal breathing rate. His heart rate will go back to normal as he's getting, plenty of oxygen in and stuff. He's going to go back to digesting and all those kinds of things, right? He's going to secrete, the stress hormones are going to start to get absorbed up so that he stops having, all this cortisol floating through his body and this epinephrine floating through his body. And he will now be able to have normal immune functioning again. So our, physiological arousal, our autonomic nervous system was designed for this kind of quick response. It's not really designed for long-term endurance of a stressor. And so when we talk about emotions, it's really super important for you to remember that emotions are brief, that the system that supports emotions is designed to be brief. And that's what we see, is that true emotions are quite fleeting. All right, this is a good time to take a break because we're going to shift a little bit to, the high road and the low road of our brain in the next segment.